There are flows which are recorded, and there are others that go under the cover of the night. These are the ones we are talking about. But there are also flows which move in broad daylight, which have questionable motives and questionable. The three main ones that we have emphasized so far are the leakage of public debt inflows. So when the governments borrow money, it's to build roads. I heard one of the speakers talked about Ethiopia, how they have changed the country through infrastructure. I lived in Ethiopia. I know how it has moved so fast, having a first-class infrastructure. That's because the government went out and borrowed money and used it legitimately and diligently to build infrastructure. But unfortunately, there are cases where the money is borrowed and only a fraction of it is used to build the infrastructure. That's the reason why, in many cases, you walk on roads which are breaking and they tell you they were built 6 months ago. Because 100 million was borrowed, only 60 million was used, the rest goes out. This is one of the channels of capital flight. The other is when also private capital is channeled out of the country without being recorded. And there are actually concerns that sometimes foreign direct investment or portfolio flows can also be used as a way of channeling money in offshore financial centers. So in that case, African economies become only a routing mechanism for bringing that money in offshore financial centers. Other mechanism is unrecorded trade, which we call trade misinvoicing. In the case where exporters record a much smaller amount of their invoice, Angola, and Melvin is trying to help us understand what is the role of institutions in driving capital flight, facilitating capital flight. Jean is working on the case of Ivory Coast. So why do we want to go to country studies? One, again, we want to go from the forest to the trees, but we also want to investigate the mechanisms, the actors, who are those people who own those resources. The enablers, it's not just the actors themselves, it's the enablers who allow them to acquire the funds, siphon the funds out of the country, and keep them hidden. We want to look at capital flight as a global phenomenon. It's a global phenomenon. Many times when you talk about capital flight, when I talk about capital flight, people tell me, Léonce, this is another story of African corruption. Okay, let's do a simple exercise very quickly. Let's all imagine that there is a universe where only one continent is corrupt. Would we have capital flight from that continent? No. Because the other continent which are so clean will not accept corrupt money. So if there is capital flight, if there is money being stolen from African countries and hidden in offshore financial centers, the responsibility is on both sides. So that's why we talk about a network. It's a transnational network of takers, people who take what they did not earn, people who take public resources and convert them in their own assets, but they are helped with a set of enablers, banks, accounting firms, specialize in creating. And the moment you start digging in the cocoa sector, it's like when you're peeling an onion. Any layer you remove makes your eyes cry more, because the cocoa sector is owned by foreigners in Côte d'Ivoire. If you want to see the legacy of colonization, we'll show it to you when we produce the result on Côte d'Ivoire. And that's why you don't know who is exporting, where it is exporting, and it becomes difficult to know how much Côte d'Ivoire is getting from its cocoa. For Angola, one peculiar thing is that we find that there is, in most countries you would expect that most of the flows, private flows, are inflows, FDI inflows. In the case of Angola, we have lots of private capital outflows. Who are those people who have so much money that they don't want to invest it in Angola and choose to invest it abroad? So these are the phenomena that we want to look at and see who are the owners of those capital. So the questions we want to ask are, Why do African savers prefer foreign assets over domestic assets? Why do rich people choose to smuggle money abroad? Why do the elite choose to keep their money abroad? And why do they circumvent regulations to sending money? Because if they own the money legally, nobody prevents them from sending it abroad. So we want to know why. And why do they disguise the private asset abroad? My economists in the room, my finance people in the room will tell me the reason why Africans who are rich or acquire this money choose to invest abroad is because they are afraid of uncertainty, want to earn higher returns, and all that. If that was the case, why is it that then foreign investors are investing in Africa? Do they know something that Africans don't know? The point is, we have tried everything we can to test econometrically whether, in fact, capital flight is driven by higher returns abroad. It doesn't work, because that money is not driven by earning higher returns. It's driven by the purpose of being hidden, and that's the reason. So I'm going to now call Jim Henry to tell you what he's going to, what he's working on in the case of South Africa. Jim?
Can you do one slide? Move one slide from below. The mic, there we go, good. The slides are really hard to see, but I thought I would start off with a talk about bananas. So we have a nice dessert. My focus here is on the kind of context that we have for our estimates of capital flight. We've missed your conference, came in late here, but you spent a lot of time talking about regional issues and regional trade cooperation. I think this is a great example. Capital flight is a great example, as is trade, of an issue that really cannot be dealt with at a country-specific level only. It requires collaboration among countries. And capital flight is exactly the same story because we have a world system in place that facilitates this. The standard unit of analysis in development economics is the country. Well, Africa has 54 countries as a result of colonial legacy and other factors. And many of those countries are facing internal strife, so maybe it's, that number is even low. But I think what we want to emphasize is the 40 years of tax competition that we've had as the official policy of entities like the OECD. Just hasn't worked, especially for developing countries. We have a phenomenon where capital flight has grown, illicit financial flows have grown dramatically. There's arguments to be made about how we measure them exactly. But what's missing from the standard analysis of financial flows, underground flows, is the question of where the money goes. And there's a stock of capital flight out there, a wealth stock, flight wealth, that's been accumulated by something we call the global haven industry. And this consists of a lot of the largest accounting firms, banks, multinational companies, law firms. Our estimates on the individual private banking side, it's at least $24 to $36 trillion offshore. That's at least 15% of global financial wealth. And on the multinational company side, we have had the example of US companies alone parking more than $2.6 trillion offshore tax-free. So we're talking about a system that encourages tax dodging on a systematic basis. And it also is a system that exploits the trade system, misinvoicing of trade. And the banana industry turns out to be a pretty good example of that. So I'll give you an example of a Latin American case where we're talking about one of the biggest banana exporters. They start off in Ecuador with bananas that they acquire on the order of 20 cents a pound. They pay about 1.5 cents per pound for export taxes in Ecuador. And then they have a chain, like many multinational companies do, of captive subsidiaries. 60% of trade goes through captive subsidiaries these days. So here's Chiquita Banana has a Cayman Islands subsidiary that charges the parent 12 cents a pound for the purchasing network. It has a subsidiary in Luxembourg that charges 12 cents a pound for the financial services. It has a subsidiary in Ireland charging 6 cents per pound for the brand intellectual property. Ireland's a favorite place to park software and intellectual property if you're a multinational company, because you can become effectively a citizen of nowhere for tax purposes. Isle of Man provides Chiquita with an insurance services for 6 cents a pound. Then we have Jersey, the Isle of Jersey and the Channel Islands, 6 cents a pound for management services. And back to the Bermuda for the distribution network. And finally, we get to the imports into the UK. And this data is a little old, but it basically the same proportions apply. So at the end of the day, the bananas end up in the UK, 91 cents a pound. And how much tax was paid on that? 1.5 cents. This is an illustration of the international tax system for taxing multinational trade. And it's based on transactions which are not arm's length. But the OECD standard for deciding whether transfer prices are fair is to assume that there's perfect competition among all these entities that are owned by the same parent. But as an Indian economist once said, actually the invisible hand is nowhere to be seen in this system. There are no competitive prices for all of these intermediate companies. And it's a fiction that the whole OECD system for taxing trade has been based on. And that's a system that is, I think, penalized countries, especially in Africa, that are commodity exporters, because there's an extraordinary amount of trade misinvoicing and the use of these captive entities to capture the profits. I've recently been taking a look at a company within South Africa, one of the largest exporters of a strategic material, and all of the profits are parked in Malta. The exports through Malta, where the sales team is supposedly provided, gets about 10 cents on every dollar of sales by this major player in the international chromite industry. So that's a glaring example. You can go from one industry to another. One of the messages that this kind of analysis has for us as we think about regional trade integration and reforming the international trade system is that we really do have an opportunity to raise tax revenue as opposed to give up tax revenue in the form of tariff reduction. If we want to see improved finances, we have an opportunity when we move to a regional level and get out of the tax competition industry to improve the standards by which we measure trade, to have much better auditing of trade transactions across borders, to make sure that multinational companies are fully accounting for their exports and their imports on an appropriate basis, and to actually collect more revenue, not less, as a result. So this is an agenda that includes trade and tax cooperation as opposed to tax competition. Well, what I'm really talking about here is a global haven industry. Let me get back to the big picture. A global haven industry that's not just about taxation, it's not just about trade, it actually is a financial secrecy network that operates across now more than 111 offshore jurisdictions and provides services to quite a few different pathologies from the standpoint of development. It helps kleptocrats hide assets offshore. It helps organized crime engage in a rapid expansion of transnational crime like we've seen in the last 2 decades. It helps private individuals who have access to wealth and just want to dodge taxes invest their money with banks in the UK and the US and Switzerland, which have made it very easy to keep those assets secret once they're there. Those are indeed the major players in the global haven industry, not the conduit havens, but the destination havens, where people actually want to invest their money. It's also facilitated this sort of profit shifting that major multinationals like Apple and Google and Microsoft and many of the commodity trading companies have been using to park profits offshore and to load up the developing country subsidiaries with debt or to use a variety of other vehicles. I've examined that in depth on the South African case basis, and we've examined the specific kinds of enablers, what we call the enablers, who are basically making these kinds of practices more common. And we have 6 case studies that we've developed. I'm not going to be able to share them all with you today, but I'll just give you a few examples. In addition to transnational crime and tax dodging and kleptocracy, we also have the business of odious finance, bad banking, which is going through under-regulated havens and jurisdictions. Some of these jurisdictions that are under-regulated are actually onshore jurisdictions, like the state of Delaware in the United States is a major player in this business. What they all share in common is a kind of financial secrecy, weak regulation and taxation, an abundance of professional enabler services, and access, ironically enough, to the rule of law, because a lot of these companies depend on having independent judiciaries and courts to enforce the rules. It's ironic that they're, in a sense, violating the rules when they take the money out of the source countries, but ultimately they want to be protected as investors as well. So this is the Star Wars bar scene, if you've seen the movie Star Wars. All the various kinds of criminals, the kleptocrats, the tax dodgers, the bad bankers, and sitting around the same basic facilities and sharing those facilities. That's the problem that we have to deal with. And it's really a question, ultimately, of political will, not of technology. Well, the EU has waked up to this problem in the last few years, and I've worked a lot as one of the original people involved with the Tax Justice Network to try to combat tax havens. We thought we were making progress. In December of 2017, they came up with this list of blacklists. They finally were going to put together a blacklist of tax havens that were engaged in shady practices. But when we look at this is on iChart, I'll give you the highlights. Basically, you ended up, as of March of this year, with a handful of tiny, irrelevant havens like Palau and Samoa still on the list, and most of the other initial members of the 20 countries that they identified had been shifted to the gray list, which meant they were just being discussed. Meanwhile, the largest havens in the world by any objective measures in terms of financial secrecy, the size of the enabler community, the size of the assets that actually are managed there and are destined there, are these 3 critical destination havens. The United States moved up rapidly in this list as one of the most aggressive tax havens in the world, especially after the last December's corporate tax cut. The UK SpiderNet, which is kind of the UK plus a network of more than 30 havens around the planet, in places like BVI and Bermuda, Cayman Islands, and finally Switzerland, which is notorious for its behavior in this arena. And that behavior, has shifted over the years, but what our results show is that it's still the key player in the industry. So those are the players. The global haven industry, worldwide, we estimate, it has all these different components, but if we can actually put numbers on it, we find it useful to at least get people's attention and to focus the debate. As I said, the private banking industry is attracting cross-border haven assets on the order of 24 to 36 trillion. We have estimated that in several different ways, and we can talk about the estimation methods. South Africa alone has flight wealth abroad on the order of $200 to $250 billion. Other countries like Nigeria have even more. The good news is that fund is sitting out there waiting to come back. And so if we can figure out ways to attract the capital home, and you know, a lot of that has to do with the rule of law, with having attractive investment opportunities, but also with enforcing the law here as well as abroad, and working with your partners and your neighboring countries to establish tax cooperation. If we can bring that back, that's available to us as an extra resource. Human capital flight is another aspect of this. The World Bank is now beginning to quantify the size of that, but I've been working on that for quite a few years. One of the shameful things about the world system is that we have more than $650 billion of remittances that are flowing through this system every year. It's the largest single source of foreign exchange for many countries like Haiti. Here it's substantial, it's important in Africa. South Africa actually pays more remittances out to poorer countries than it collects. But companies like Western Union have managed to get their foot in the door there, and are collecting, in some cases like Haiti, as much as 10 to 15% of every dollar that's sent by the poorest people on the planet back home. So that's an aspect of this that is related to this, in a sense, a global private tax that's being levied by the transfer agents. There's a real opportunity, we believe, to use new technologies like, you know, M-Pesa in Kenya, and some of the work that's being done with international remittances by internet startups in India and Philippines to really attack that and drive down the cost of sending that money home. And finally, we've seen recently very disturbing trend toward interference across borders using technologies like Facebook in people's elections. Kenya is a good example of that. I'm sure you're aware of what happened in April 2017 in that election. But we actually need to worry about the global haven system interfering in our country's politics as well. Well, when I was asked by Iceland to take a look at the Panama Papers and the implications for Iceland, 2016, we discovered that Iceland had basically its president and prime minister had basically parked money abroad using the global haven system. And a lot of Iceland banks had basically gone belly up in 2008. One of the things we found was that the system that had been erected, and Iceland is a country of 300,000 people, it's a first world country, high incomes, it basically lost the power to regulate its own banking system. And this is the maze that we found when we looked under the cover in terms of intercompany holdings within the banking system in Iceland. It's a glaring example of what we call odious finance and another use of the haven system to undermine state and development. In the case of the enablers in South Africa, I just want to highlight a couple examples, and I'm going to stop with the slideshow because I think it's hard to manipulate all the slides we have. But one example that disturbed me the most, I think, of all the ones that I came across in studying what had been going on, was an example of a major Wall Street bank basically setting up a very sophisticated system involving 18 offshore companies, virtually unauditable, and selling this scheme to generate foreign tax credits to the wealthiest guy in South Africa so that he could minimize his tax collection. I mean, that's an example of where this global system basically, this is not something that is designed within the countries on their own. It isn't a property of the institutions within, or institutional failure within developing countries. It's a system that's collateral damage from the way that we have failed to regulate the behavior of our world's largest banks, accounting firms, and law transactions. And and just on the basis of improved enforcement and improved cooperation. So let me conclude there, and we'll be happy to take questions. Thanks very much.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about the anatomy. However, if I jumped into giving you examples without providing context, pushes back. One thing is to talk about a policy as if you're the only one in the playing field. But because the money involved is huge, when you push, they push back. And most times, they actually have more arsenal than the good guys. You think about the dark side of the force and the light side of the force. Most times, the criminals are ahead of the curve. So it's a very difficult thing to do. It's not as simple as policies, because policies need to be implemented. Okay. So my job here is to talk about institutions and the nexus, that is the linkage between capital flight and governance. And governance is part of institutions. So to appreciate and when nobody's actually watching you. And it's the same reason people tell you, didn't your mother teach you anything? The reason why people don't trash in Rwanda even when the police is not looking. So that's part of institution, but there's also the formal rules. Sometimes you do it and the police will catch you and you face the consequences. But even the enforcement itself has three manifolds. The first party enforcement, which is morality, values, what you do even when nobody's watching. Then the second party enforcement, which relies on ability to retaliate. If you push somebody, it's going to punch you back. If you borrow my money and we don't want to go to court, I come at you with a lead pipe if I can get away with it. That's the second party enforcement. But of course, sometimes people don't want to fight and they won't transact if they think it's not going to work because they don't want to get into the trouble. Then there's the third party enforcement that relies on laws and the government to help people conclude transactions. So when you put all this together, that's the chemistry between the formal, the informal, and all these enforcement characteristics is what really defines an institution. So it's a complex mechanism. And when we talk about institutions as the rules of the game, that means it's the incentive that determines if we're going to do what we want to do. It's what encourages us whether we should whether we can get away with murder or we can't, whether we should behave or not behave. I watched the movie Inside Job. It's the movie about the financial crisis in the US many years ago. And one of the telling parts was when one of the bankers went to the regulator, the IMF regulator, and he said, you have to regulate us. The money is too much. We can't help ourselves. We want you to regulate us. The pork is, excuse the expression, is just too much. So sometimes we get into trouble. So somebody needs to be there to look at what's happening. So sometimes the incentive structure is so strong, the temptation is so strong that somebody has to watch over. But even the enforcement is very expensive, and sometimes we don't have the resources or the stomach. So it's not as trivial or simple as people would want it to be, unfortunately. Okay. So having said that, giving you a background on incentive, what's the thesis of this presentation? What's my point? My point is that the structure of incentives encourage capital flight. That when we say it's the institutions, people get what they deserve. And the question here is, what is it we do that makes us deserve what we get? Okay. Well, let's think about committing a crime as an enterprise. Because this kind of crime, especially white-collar crime, you pardon the pun, no pun intended, white-collar crime, people sit down, as you said, across the table, and they do the calculus of cost and benefits. Okay, and the way, the approach I've taken here is to look at the factors affecting the likelihood of successful predicate crime. Can I get away with this when I do it? As the saying goes, what the big corporations do is, can we get away with this? It's not about being legal. So you call the general counsel and you say, look at it, do we have plausible deniability? Is there enough distance between us and the crime to get away with it? Okay. And then the second, of course, is if you commit a crime and there is a benefit, but if you swallow the benefit and it gives you constipation and you can't digest it, then it's problematic. So you want to make sure that if you commit the crime, you get the proceeds, you can quietly consume the proceeds without having any problem. That's why you need money laundering. You need to wash it, because in the primary form, just like crude oil, you got to do the separation between the gas and the crude, and the water and the crude, and then you have to refine it, and so on and so forth. So the same way, the tainted proceeds got to be cleaned. So money laundering is an adjuvant to the predicate crime. And like I said with the scissors, you can't look at one side without looking at the other to get the complete picture of how this can happen. And that's where we look at the institutions. How do the institutions enable the predicate crime and enable money laundering? If you can get at this, then you can begin a meaningful fight against capital flight. So let's look at the enforcement characteristics first. That's where the governance comes in. You can't do this without government. Why? Because government has a monopoly on legitimate violence. And sometimes you got to do the tough stuff. Individuals can't do it. So it's one thing to talk about it, but if the government does not come along, it's not going to work. Second, you can't successfully prosecute capital flight without government acquiescence because of third-party enforcement. You have to go across countries. The coordination, I can't just go up to Britain and say, give me Nigerian money, or give me South African money, say, get out of town. You don't have the local standees, so we need the government to do that. The danger in that, of course, is often the politicians are self-interested. So if the ghostbuster is the ghost, what are you going to do? Okay, so that is some of the problems that we deal. Then the second part, of course, and that's the point I just made. The second part is the rules of the game on data validation. There are many ways to skin the cat. So you make sure that the data rules are so complicated that you get into some of this argument about whether the estimates is correct. Do you have evidence for what is happening? So you argue around the beta, as we say in economics, rather than arguing about the substance. It says your estimate is not correct. It's got simultaneity effects. It's got non-stationarity. So it's a red herring around discussing the substance of the issue. And I've looked at some of the data conventions with the International Merchandise Trade Statistics. It's very difficult to reconcile these trade statistics. So there is plausible deniability that makes it even more difficult to deal with these issues. Okay. And the third part, of course, is the frame. Whether the cup is half empty or the cup is half filled matters a lot in law. And this is why when people don't understand lawyers, and they say they argue against irrelevancies. They don't. The pre-trial motions and what you exclude and what you don't exclude and the jury selection is almost as if the trial is predetermined before you start. So those things are very important. Even in statistics, the nature of the estimation, how you set up the hypothesis, and these things matter for the conclusion. So this is part of the game, the soft part of the game that sometimes people don't see. So you sue somebody in court, he gets off on a technicality, and people don't understand why that alleged criminal is still working. And this is why you need research to be able to understand the depth of what is happening. Now, here is an example of what I'm talking about, using data to obfuscate the argument. This says there's a country code in the IMTS called ZN. This ZN allows a country to classify its export or import as origins of goods is unknown. And that's acceptable. And for South Africa, this is how they've worked this loophole in the system. They said, for purposes of better understanding, this has been renamed to gold, the country code ZN, petroleum, and others, as over 95% of this bubble is made up of gold. In other words, we don't want to talk about gold, so we'll classify it as ZN. And it says gold, due to legacy rules, is treated as a country. If you go to the SARS website, you're going to see this, as incredible as it seems. Okay. And second paragraph, it tells you, you will therefore not be able to determine where the exports are going and where the imports are coming from. And it says, we're still working on it. We'll get to it later because it's a legacy issue. It's going to take us time to unravel these issues. And hence, when you present your estimates, they start arguing with the estimates. It's because you didn't follow our convention. We did it a different way. You did it your own way. And therefore, that's why we can't reconcile. Okay. This is not an idle talk. There's actually an ongoing debate that started in 2016 when UNCTAD published a report on asymmetries in mirror statistics. And the South African Chamber of Commerce and the South African Revenue Service and the Office of the Statistician General that felt that this was reflecting bad on them came back punching. First, they said the South Africa reports according to the UN Special Trade System. Other countries that we export to use the general trade system. So their books, they do it their way, we do it our way. So if the researchers are trying to reconcile these two, it's impossible. So we don't know if you're right or I'm wrong, and since there's an ambiguity, let's all just go home and forget about it. And for interest of time, I'm not going to talk a little more about mirror information. But let's talk about money laundering. What I've just discussed is the predicate crime, the probability of whether you want to commit the crime or not. So if the terrain is very murky, you keep saying, I think I can get away with this. And your general counsel would say, you can argue this or that or that. So it's really difficult. So he says, it's fine, we can do this. And then secondly, but even if we succeed, can we digest these proceeds? For you to understand the issue about money laundering, you need to look at the value proposition. And you don't want me to talk about this? No. The value proposition gives you a very good insight in what is happening. Because first there is the crime, and there's the crime proceeds. And there's the crime proceeds, and there's the clean transform. But the clean transform is not enough. The criminal needs to get access to that clean transform, and the criminal doesn't have to be a criminal. So you've got to separate the crime from the proceeds. You've got to separate the proceeds from the clean transform. You have to make sure that the criminal has unfettered access to the clean transform, and the criminal cannot be identified, so you become any other citizen. This is a very complex trillion-dollar business. So you could see why it pushes back. And because of the huge amount of money, the innovation is continuous. Even when the legislatures are thinking about the law, they are thinking about countermeasures to get around that. Okay, because everything you have, they have more on that. So this shows you the terrain that you're trying to fight. Still, there are ways in which we can address this. Okay. First is how fast money moves these days. And secondly is how easy it is for you to hide the money. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we may not be able to go through everything, but I want to show you a device that allows you to hide trillions of dollars. It's just a USB device. It's called OpenDime. This is a cold wallet. That means it's not linked to the internet. You can put it in your pocket, and you can take it across the border, and you can load it. It's a Bitcoin wallet. But this one here is a nano ledger. This means it accepts 24 different currencies. This is specific to a Bitcoin. Okay? And all you have to do is Google opendime.com, and you would see. And they brag about it. It says the encryption technology, you can't break it. You can't tamper it. So they say, we are the money laundering tools. That's what we do, and we're the best at what we do. Come get me. That's how arrogant the system is. And of course, the current varieties of money, the innovations in the system on a daily basis makes it very difficult to catch the criminals. Okay. Of course, now you know that it's not just the traditional money. Now you have fiat money, you have digital money. And even with the digital money, you've got the virtual currency. And with the virtual currency, you have the tumblers or the anonymizers, which do for money what the Entreport does for trade. Because what the Entreport is an anonymizer. They come in different directions. You don't know the origin, you don't know the destination. They don't have to report that. The commodity traders love it. So on the one hand, you have the anonymizers for the real trade of the economy. On the other hand, you have the anonymizers for the financial side of the economy. what are the takeaways? One, we need to be proactive and constructively transparent. What do I mean by constructively transparent? If you think about Ronald Reagan during the struggle for apartheid, and people were saying to the U.S., you need to divest from South Africa. And he said, no, we need constructive engagement. That was very interesting at the time. So constructive means we don't want governments to be totally transparent, because there are certain transactions that by its nature has to be done closed doors. But they need to be sufficiently transparent so that the people can monitor what is going on. That's why I mean by constructively transparent. So the researchers can try to unpack the meaning of that word. And then they also need to be, not to be reactive. You need a combination of police and audit techniques. It's not sufficient after the criminals, after the fact. You also need to be a little preventative in trying to monitor, and that's where intelligence becomes very important. And the whistleblowing mechanism as well, so that the public will know you're very serious about what's happening. And now I want to give you, if you allow me 5 more minutes, I want to give you an application to onshore and for monitoring the chain of custody on the oil value chain, at least for the offshore assets. If there are too many insurgency problems with the onshore, maybe the offshore, which is vertically integrated, they can share the platform information. And let me show you the technology for sharing those platform information. This is the Panoramic Digital Command Center at ADNOC. ADNOC is the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. This is cutting-edge technology. It was installed by Schneider Electric. It was just launched, in fact, I think it was this month. This allows them to see all the pipelines, the offloading, the unloading, the ships that have taken them from the module, command module in Abu Dhabi in real time. Okay. And this was the prototype built for Schneider Electric to show them what's happening. And it's gone live actually in Abu Dhabi at the moment. And you can Google that and you will see that. So this can happen. And given, of course, the amount of money that we lose, we can easily install this kind of technology. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the details of this technology. But one interesting thing is that if you add blockchain technology or distributed systems to it, then both the different departments of the government can be sure that they're not being shortchanged by the other system. And including the drilling, the oil producing, and the government and the buyers can share the same information in real time. Okay. What about control, compliance, and monitoring? The marine domain assessment software allows you, in the same way that air traffic controllers can monitor aircraft incoming and outgoing anywhere they are, the marine technology exists that monitor the ships both within your territorial waters and outside your territorial waters, and link to the participating naval forces so that you can interdict both the pirates and the bunkering, people stealing the oil. And there's enough technology to deal with littoral and blue sea water interception. Littoral means like along the delta where you can use some of the boats. But you have to equip the Navy to be able to do this. Now, let me, one more thing and I'll quit. I just want to give you an instance of the amount of money that's been stolen or defrauded one country and how much it cost to buy a Coast Guard cutter, a Coast Guard cutter or a fast attack patrol boat, just to show you that governments can do this if they really want to do it. This is the last, and then I'll quit. Okay. This is how you can track the ship movements, by the way. Private jetties. Okay. This is MTN, $8 billion illegally taken from Nigeria. And they've agreed, actually, they've reached an agreement with the central bank, with the banks that participated in the fraud, to return the money. This is a ship that was bought by the Nigerian Navy. It was donated by, I say, Coast Guard cutter from the US, and it was refurbished with $8 million. But if you think about $8 billion illegally taken away from one country, it gives you an idea that that's enough to equip a carrier fleet. I'm just going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I wish we had all the day to listen to that. It's very interesting. I'm sure that when the report is published, everyone would be interested. Will be interested in reading the document. Actually, why I wanted him to stop was that we could get some reactions from all of us. And again, I'm going to start from that way and go this way fast. 1 minute, not more. If you talk about more than 1 minute, I will stop you. Your name? Yeah, your name, institution, and your comment or question.
Thank you very much. My name is Lilian Bay, and I work at the African Development Bank at the Research Department. I think it's like a novel. Unfortunately, it's true, but I find it's very, very fascinating. I just have 3 quick points.
Wow.
Maybe just very quick. No worries, Jeremy. Very, very quick. So the first one is that your 3 specific studies mainly looked at countries that are commodities exporters. So Cote d'Ivoire is cocoa, for South Africa gold, Angola, I guess it's oil. So I wonder, because you mentioned the governance issue, I wonder if you could have the same non-commodities exporters country. Or maybe this is a naive question, I don't know, maybe it would be the same pattern, but I would be track these things and so on, prevent it. But I wonder, how can we get it back at the first place? What can we do to get back the money at the first place? Because, I mean, it's good to prevent, but we know that there are already, you know, capital flight has been a big issue. What are the mechanisms, the instruments we can put in place to get back the money that already flow? And the last point, and I would like to relate this to the theme of the conference, which is regional integration. And I was happy that during the second presentation you mentioned this global heaven industry, and we know that at a global level, and also in developed countries, that's a big issue. Tax evasion is a big issue, it's a hot topic. Governments are very much interested in that. And I would like to link it to the issue of inclusiveness and inequality. Because we are then at the core of development issues above all for Africa. This money could have served to fund development projects. While we're talking about regional integration, countries at regional level can leverage their power to deal with this issue. And lastly, related to that, do we really want it? Because you talk about governance issue, and you mentioned that, you know, it's kind of very tricky, because basically there are the same people, you know, that are supposed to fight, that are kind of involved. So do we really want to get this money back? Do we really want to prevent this from happening? Thank you.
No, we'll take all of them, yes. Any other hand? Okay, immediately after.
Titus Awukushe from Michigan State University. I think that this has been really interesting presentations. As I listen to you, I'm thinking about how the market for capital flights is very similar to the market for illegal drugs. I'm also thinking in terms of the industrial organization story behind this. So you can look at the supply side as being competitive because you have so many players. But on the demand side, you have fewer players, but they're very powerful. So my concern then is, how do you address the problem? Do you cut off the demand side, or do you cut off the supply side? Because to have a market, you have to have both sides. If you don't have suppliers, you don't have a market. If you don't have demanders, you don't have a market. So in terms of really tackling the problem, where do you see the greatest potential for gains in reducing or eliminating capital flight?
Okay. Right. Third person here. Yeah, we'll go in.
Thank you very much. I think this is the best way to end our session. And let me point to the fact that what I heard from this session is very interesting piece. Oh, my name is Stanley Kamara.
And
my name is
affiliation.
Stanley Kamara. I'm from UNDP.
Okay.
When I listen to you, I tend to realize that you were discussing capital flight in the context of the transfers and acquisitions. And you will be able to classify this issue in 4 categories. The issue of legal and illegal transfers and legal acquisitions. So if you were to place a policy premium in terms of what action government to take, will you focus more on the legality of the transfer or the legality of the acquisition? In that case, you might have clean capital, you might have dirty capital, you might have smuggled capital and laundered capital. So if I am a government, a capital is legally recorded in terms of its transfer, but illegally acquired. A capital is legally acquired, but illegally transferred, and so on and so forth. Where will we place the premium in terms of policy action? Is it on the legality of the acquisition or on the legality of the transfer? That is recorded and unrecorded. That's one. 2, related to this capital flight is the issues of odious debt, wherein an illegitimate regime enters into some contracting with an external agent, and this becomes a commitment of the successor government. What then do we do in this instance? Is there a global compact that can address this issue? Thank you.
Very good. So here.
Thank you. My name is Adam Al-Harika from United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. I would like to thank my friends for the presentations, but I think we have serious issue, very, very serious issue to take up, and maybe we need some legal minds here also to help us address it. The definition of capital flight. I think the word, Leon said capital flight is part of illicit financial flows. According to the report of the high-level panel led by Thabo Mbeki, and the work on this report started back in 2010 during Conference of Ministers in Lilongwe, Malawi. Illicit financial flows are different from capital flight because they are illicit, they are illegal. And the sources of illicit financial flows are trade misinvoicing. Of course, the main objective is dodging tax and so on, and these captive subsidiaries play a role. I know a lot of stories, if I have 10 minutes to tell, but I know I don't have 10 minutes. Then criminal trade misinvoicing accounts for 65% of illicit financial flows out of Africa. Criminal activities, we also talked about as capital flight, account for 30%. We know that corruption is a cross-cutting issue, but outright corruption accounts for only 5% of illicit financial flows out of Africa. So what you have defined, Leonce and James, in terms of sources of capital flight are actually in our definition all illicit financial flows. And this is a big issue. A big issue because international institutions, especially World Bank, IMF, consider capital flight as legal flows. And the main reason is bad business environment, corruption, and so on. So to address them, there are no outsiders to blame. Just blame yourself and look at your business environment and so on. Correct it. So the policy implications are very different. Illicit financial flows have both, businesses working inside the countries, especially those in the extractive sector, and businesses, banks, and so on, and institutions outside. So we want to be clear on this, because if we call them capital flight, we are in troubles. Okay. Let us call them illicit financial flows and work as African Union head of states endorse the recommendations of the high-level panel, work with partners. We cannot do it alone. And the high-level panel actually visited the US, Europe, many countries in Africa, and we spoke with them. And some financial institutions, international financial institutions in the US, in Washington, told us that they are no business about illicit financial flows. But when you went to the Treasury Department in the US, they told us we have issues with criminal activities, terrorism, and so on, and we will tell these institutions what to do. But they don't want to talk about beneficial ownership. Only 2 countries in Europe were willing to talk about beneficial ownership. So I think we need to be clear on these definitions. Thank you.
Adam, maybe you propose that as a team of a future AEC. I see the hand of a lady there.
Thank you. My name is Crystal Simeoni, Head of Advocacy.
Please,
louder. Okay. My name is Crystal Simeoni, Head of Advocacy and also Economic Justice Lead. And in a last life, I worked for TGNA. So I feel like I'm amongst friends. For most of my career around tax justice, it's always been outward. It's the $100 billion with the last estimates that leave the continent. But recently, I've been doing some work on South Sudan. And from 2012 to now, South Sudan has lost $4 billion coming out of South Sudan into Kenyan and Ugandan jurisdictions in a country where 90% of the women are illiterate, where maternal mortality indicators are so bad. It means there's a cost benefit. There's money that could be used to make the lives of women and girls better, but is leaving the country into East Africa. And so, as much as we look outward, I'm wondering how and what we're doing to look inwards. Kenya is looking to set up the Nairobi International Financial Center. What that means, does it create a space that acts like a tax haven? What does it mean for the money that leaves illicitly from South Sudan into our very own African jurisdictions? So as much as we're looking out, and that's the lens in which I have looked out for so long, I'm now sort of, my head's turned a little upside down in terms of looking inwardly, and I'm pretty sure the same could go for the DRC and many other countries that are experiencing conflict as well.
Thank you very much. As we are in Rwanda, we need another lady there.
Thank you very much. Jeanette Modongo Kamara, UNDP. Thanks for this presentation. As at the end, it was populations that are the losers, because the tax evasion signifies that there is less public finance revenue. From resource natural exploitation illegal signifies that resource natural are population goods, nation goods. So exploiting resource natural illegally the loser are population. So my question is, how are those populations involved in the fight of illicit transfer fund? Because if...
1 minute, please.
OK.
Allez-y.
OK. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je crois que cet exposé de fin de cette réunion, vraiment, moi, il m'attriste. Et j'ai l'impression de revenir...
Can we know who you are before?
Mon nom, c'est Dr Garba Yahya. Je suis le directeur général de l'agriculture du Niger. Donc, avec tous ces capitaux qui sont en train de fuir, est-ce que nous sommes mal partis ou bien nous sommes étranglés? Vraiment, on doit se poser cette question. Ces capitaux devraient nous permettre de développer l'agriculture, d'être autosuffisants et vraiment de limiter toute importation. Combien de milliards sont mis pour les importations? Donc, si ces fuites de capitaux, on ne peut pas les contrôler, mais nous avons une autre perte de capitaux. Les pertes de capitaux qui sont destinées aux importations, parfois de denrées alimentaires impropres à la consommation. Avant-hier, on parlait de trentaines de milliards de dollars. Des riz qui est importé en fin de vie, qui n'est pas contrôlé, qui est vendu à nos populations et qui est même source de maladies, diabète, tension. Parce que ce riz-là, il n'a aucune valeur nutritive. Ça, nous pouvons le contrôler, Monsieur le Président, grâce à l'intégration africaine. Nous avons énormément de terres fertiles. Nous avons un potentiel pastoral énorme. Son exploitation, il faut qu'on le mette en avant. Tous nos projets de développement doivent aller vers là-bas. Et comme je l'ai dit, c'est des problèmes structurels. Il faut que nous, notre intégration là, qu'on cherche, et qui doit être vraiment notre leitmotiv, qui doit être notre mot d'ordre, il faut qu'on arrive à cette intégration-là pour pouvoir exploiter nos propres ressources. Je ne parle pas des ressources naturelles, les ressources minières, mais au moins les ressources agro-pastorales, quand même, l'argent qui est destiné aux exportations de denrées alimentaires, si on les met dans nos pays, grâce à cette intégration inclusive,
merci beaucoup.
Je pense qu'avec beaucoup, nous pouvons faire beaucoup en peu de temps.
Merci
quand
beaucoup.
on est dispersé,
merci
qui
beaucoup.
dit dispersion dit disparition. Et donc, il faut qu'on fasse attention. Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Okay, given the interest here, we are running against time, but yours, because you miss your time, half a minute each to the two of you. Please, microphone. Very good.
Thank you very much. My name is Omar Radi. I'm a journalist and communications consultant based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. My name is Omar Radi. I'm a journalist and communications consultant based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. My question is specific. When it comes to this capital flight, illicit financial flows and related things, most of the time the role of the media seem to be neglected in exposing these things before they happen, or in educating the public to be alert about these issues. In most cases, what we see, the media we see playing roles are in the destination countries, in the European, the Northern Hemisphere generally. What do you recommend for media in Africa to do, and what do you recommend for African governments to do in relation to enabling media and journalists and help this fight against capital flight and illicit financial flows? Thank you.
Half a minute.
Thank you. I will express myself in French. Stéphane Akaya, conseiller du Premier ministre togolais. Je voulais juste mentionner deux choses. La première chose, je pense qu'il est important, parce que souvent quand on parle des capitaux, de la fuite des capitaux, c'est toujours dans le sens d'accuser les pays. de faire en sorte que nous soyons encore plus fragilisés que nous le sommes déjà. Je parle vraiment là en tant que quelqu'un qui vit au quotidien la pression de ces genres d'informations sur les États. C'est-à-dire que je pense que les institutions qui pilotent les finances dans le monde doivent avoir des coopérations franches avec les pays. On ne peut pas dire que les institutions de Bretton Woods, en l'occurrence le Fonds monétaire international et la Banque mondiale, ne peuvent pas régler cette question de fuite des capitaux, puisque nous sommes dans un monde où on sait très bien là où l'argent se trouve. Donc on ne peut pas incriminer les pays qui sont déjà très faibles statistiquement, parce que vous prenez les économies africaines, 80% se trouvent dans l'informel. Donc obligatoirement, vous avez des fuites que vous ne maîtrisez pas. Mais si collectivement, nous prenons l'engagement de réduire ces flux, je pense que ça sera fait très rapidement. Moi, il ne faut pas que l'Afrique, finalement, soit le centre où on lui accumule toutes les maladies, toutes les fautes, et puis finalement, on ne fait rien. Mais je pense que dans la coopération que nous avons avec ces institutions, nous devons aller plus loin. Et c'est pour ça que je voulais faire la proposition que la Banque africaine de développement peut jouer ce rôle en mettant en place le Fonds monétaire africain, où nous pouvons avoir des discussions assez franches pour que les capitaux qui sortent de l'Afrique puissent revenir dans nos pays. Deuxième chose, aujourd'hui, quand vous prenez les traités monétaires, je prends pour ce que je connais le mieux, la question du CFA. Vous pouvez prendre des milliards de francs CFA, vous allez en Europe, en France, vous les échangez tout de suite, sans que personne ne vous demande même un mot. Quand vous créez des zones aussi fluides financièrement, qu'est-ce que vous voulez? Vous êtes obligé d'avoir des flux de capitaux. Ces traités monétaires, moi je pense qu'il faut les revoir. Et collectivement en Afrique, nous devons mettre en place des institutions qui nous permettent d'avoir notre monnaie africaine où nous maîtrisons tout ce qui sort du continent. Donc, et plus encore, le fait que nous ayons ces messages négatifs sur l'Afrique, c'est que nous avons des tensions budgétaires très énormes. Je prends pour le cas de notre pays. On vous impose toujours des restrictions parce que derrière, on vous accuse de ne pas pouvoir maîtriser les flux des capitaux. Mais je dis arrêtez, soit nous sommes dans une coopération qui permet à nos États de se développer et on a des dialogues et des coopérations franches, soit nous ne voulons pas le faire et on va toujours dire l'Afrique est le terrain de tous les maux. Donc voilà un peu ma contribution au débat.
Cool. I'm in a quandary now because we've overrun the time, but our presenters will have to respond, and I'm encouraging them not to respond to every item because there are so many of them. I want to be very generous, 3 minutes maximum. If you exceed 3 minutes, I will stop you. Who would want to start? Okay.
I'm going to address 4 comments, but 2 of them are interrelated. And that's what my friend Adam said. He went into the semantics of illicit flow, capital flight. It's about missing money. Whether it's illicit or not illicit, bring back our money. So can we work together? And that's the whole point I was making about the data, the obfuscation and the smoke screen that stops us from getting to the substance. If you call it capital, we wouldn't talk about it. Washington. So that's just an example of what I said before. Okay, having said that, and to her question, the reason why we were talking about commodities has to do with identification and methodology. If the money is illicit and hidden, by definition, you can't see it. But it's by going to the balance of payments account and some of the reported statistics and trying to look at the exporter country and the importer and finding out the discrepancy and forcing people to explain is why we say there is something in smoke, whether it's fire or something as less in recovery. Because as most criminals who have gone to jail and reformed, they grow a conscience. They tell you that you had the criminal in the pocketbook. You take away the incentive. As I said, why commit the crime when you get constipation from the proceeds? So if we strengthen asset recovery, and asset recovery unfortunately requires international cooperation, it takes two to tango. It also requires the press, media awareness, and political participation. Because we got to lobby, we got to force our governments to take it very seriously, as well as engage the international partners. So awareness, media awareness is important, political participation is important. Bounty hunters also, not just whistleblowers, because sometimes people know where the money is. They can actually go grab it, give it to the government, say, give me mine. And it's not just in skipping bail. Maybe we should introduce bounty hunters. And you'll be surprised the kind of international lawyers and accountants, they will turn against you, yeah. And they'll say, I'll take it, I'll get the money, and my organ gave me this. And they'll take it to the police station. So we need some innovative approach to this problem. And the other issue about supply side, both the supply side and the demand side are not competitive at all. On the distributive trade, the big boys and girls are Glencore, Trafigura, Mercuria, Noble, Vitol. And these guys, their turnover, their daily turnover is 18 million barrels per day. Total, BP and Shell is 15 million barrels per day. So it's just tsunami. These guys are too big, you can't deal with them. So it's not a competitive market at all. And because they are not subject to know your customer requirements as the banks, they don't have to say who they bought and sold to. So it's really a very complicated issue. And on the side of the demand, one more thing on the side. If you go to Angola and Nigeria, it's the same Chevron, Exxon, Mobil. 40 years Chevron has been in Angola. They know the back roads and everything. So, and then Halliburton, they know the drills. So because of the sunk investment, it's not one of these markets where everybody goes. It's very few firms. The Chinese, you'll find them in South Africa and in Zambia. In most of the other places, it's the established. You go to South Africa, it's Anglo Gold, it's Barrick. It's not an easy market to penetrate, okay, because of the huge sunk cost involved. And they'll sit back and defend the market. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great.
Unfortunately, I couldn't get into all these details. I had the numbers and the statistics, but you better believe me for what it's worth.
Yes. Okay. Okay, Jim, we go next. 3 minutes.
Thanks for some great questions. I think we'll try to struggle to do justice to them. One I want to focus on first is this business about the analogy to the drug trade. This is different in the sense that here we have the cartel writing the drug laws. And in other words, the private banking industry, the multinational companies, they had 6,000 lobbyists in Washington designing the Trump. Same people it was lending to, and basically helped them take money outside of the country, even while it was getting other banks involved. Private banking was the most profitable single business for Citibank at that time. And when we went to audit the debt of the Philippines, I've been auditing debt in many countries. You know, the Philippines in the 1890s was a country where the United States threw out Spain and then argued that the Philippine foreign debt that it owed to Spain was odious debt because it had been incurred by a dictator. And so they didn't honor it. Global haven industry by the IMF, by the World Bank. They simply are not allowed to take an objective analysis of this. So we off $100 million a year for a fund that was basically invested in ordinary liquid securities to the extent that it was invested. You know, it's hard to call that corruption. I mean, that's something else. It's kleptocracy, but it's maybe legal. So getting too caught up in these sort of boundary lines, I think, is kind of a way of distracting us from the ultimate issue. There's an enormous amount of resources that have been parked offshore by poorest countries in the world, to the extent that the developing world as a whole, if you accumulate, make reasonable estimates about the capitalized value of the retained offshore investments and how much they've been earning, the developing world as a whole is a net creditor to the tune of about $12.3 trillion of the rich countries in the world. And this system that we talk about with respect to international taxation, it wasn't designed by developing countries by the UN Tax Committee. It was designed by the 34
of the numbers that we're giving at the country level. So we can't catch them. It's only indirect measures. And I think to echo the point made by Jim, I want to frame all this in terms of the burden of proof. Who has the burden of proof? The African countries that are losing their money to go prove that the money that's touched in offshore financial centers is theirs, or the owners of those assets to prove that they have actually acquired them legally or illegally. It's the owners of the assets who have to prove that they have the money legally and transferred illegally. But again, to do that, you need the cooperation of these Western countries where these offshore financial centers are. Because remember, as Jim said, the secrecy jurisdictions are not the small island countries. It's New York, it's London, it's Paris, it's Switzerland, it's all those big countries. So when they come and tell Africa that they want to cooperate with Africa to promote development financing, ask them, can you get back a development issue? The ones who are hurt are the poor people, the ordinary citizens like you, who don't have access to health, education that could have been built by this money. So I think, as our colleague in the media has said, we need the pressure from the public to open up the books.
Have bet heavily on financial services, you will find that that's not a good strategy.
Thank you very much. Can we give a round of applause to our panelists? Because of time, I cannot summarize anything. I'm under pressure to have actually closed some 15 minutes ago because other people are holding me right away. But you also need to give a round of applause to yourselves for staying all through.